How about you and I get in here together?
Okay.
So Neil and I want to welcome you to the Mini-May ATI, and we want to call your attention to the website. This is where we'll be posting resources. This is where we'll be doing live notes, and you are welcome to add to the live notes. It's a Google Doc out there for everybody to share. The different sessions will be recorded in case you missed something. You can come back and take a look at that. If you have not yet registered today, even though you pre-registered and put this on your calendar, we would like you to click on register at the top so that you can vote on the top 5 topics that you're interested in for August. We've been doing some pre-planning, and we want to make sure that we're meeting your needs. And then there's going to be other resources posted here. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and
Actually.
Okay.
I could have. I think we're okay. If you go back to share, I had a tab up there.
All right.
That's all I need.
Okay.
Does that start share? Are we good?
All right. And
we're there.
So we're going to turn it over to Neil Witikko, our new director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, and take it away.
Thank you. And thank you, folks, for being here. Again, I'm Neil Witikko. I teach in the School of Education, and I need to go present here. Again, I teach in the School of Education, and recently now have taken over as the director for the Center for Teaching and Learning. I want to first of all thank Academic Technologies for doing really all of the heavy lifting for our workshop today. We're co-sponsoring this, but they've done all of the setup, and I'm really grateful for that. So our focus today is we want to spend some time looking at the idea of formative assessment, providing feedback to students, and how our technologies at CSS can help us do that. Okay, so that's kind of our angle. I'm going to do just maybe 15 minutes of introductory presentation material. We're going to ask you then to share some of your experiences, especially with providing feedback for students. And then Jane, Amy, and others are going to talk about how our technologies can help us provide rich feedback to students and not kill us as faculty members, right? To make it manageable. Okay, so I want to start with just a personal story. So here we are, practices in our writing. So this was the first assignment of multiple assignments that were going to prepare me for the final exam. All right, but as a student, I was left with some questions about this. The main question I had is, could I ever be an 18? And if I could be an 18, how could I get there? And there was a 20 even within reach. Right? So as I got ready, and this paper you can see was September, I clearly forgot to type that and said there's not a chance I'm putting this thing back in the typewriter, right? So I wrote it by hand. And but as I got ready for my October paper, there probably wasn't a whole lot in this score that helped me in terms of feedback, right? We talk about formative assessment as something that measures where students are and provides useful feedback during the learning process. And what my professor did certainly was a measure during my learning process. The first paper in a semester that went all the way through December, right? Okay, so that, and in School of Education, we think a whole lot about formative assessment and what it can do for our learning process. I love this idea. When the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. When the customer tastes the soup, that's summative assessment. So formative is those checks that we do while we're still in process and we can make a difference, right? Summative is fairly anticlimactic, right? What did Witikko know at the end of the course experience? Formative assessment is really that sweet spot, there's my baseball metaphor, for deep learning. One of our most powerful tools to help students learn well is formative assessment. In the School of Education, as we're working with our teachers to be, this is huge for us, for our students to understand that the richest learning happens as we measure student progress during the learning process, not with some kind of a final exam, okay? For professors, formative assessment informs our instruction. I think so much about an earlier life I had as a German teacher. If I taught a complex grammatical topic in German, I did a check with students at the end of the hour. If students didn't understand what a direct object was, and with my formative check at the end of the hour, if only 25% of the students understood, I knew I had to come back the next day and reteach. I knew the problem was not the students. It was probably something in how I approached it, or they needed to hear it a second time. So my formative checks inform what my instruction is going to be moving forward. For professors, formative measures can also measure student progress against the objective of the lesson or the standard, whatever we're working toward in that lesson. So it tells me where students are on that learning, in that learning process. For students, formative assessment measures, again, their progress, their learning progress against the objective of the day, all right, or of the unit. For students, formative assessment should clarify the next step in the learning process. And I would argue that in the first sample I showed with my 17, that's the piece that was missing for me. There wasn't much in the 17 that really told me, how can I get better in the next paper? Okay? And one of the really important things is if we do formative assessment well, especially with rich feedback, which I'm going to talk about, students then have the ability to self-monitor. So I would argue if my professor could have just given me a little more than a 17, I can self-monitor when I'm doing formative paper number 2 and make some changes. And it could be as simple as a professor telling me, well, no, you don't use the we point of view, or you don't do this or that. Any feedback I could get helps direct me. I don't have to go back for questions. I know for the second paper how I can more closely hit the target, right? So formative assessment helps both teachers and students. This is especially important for us in the School of Ed, and not everyone will agree, but to be most effective, formative assessment should be low stakes for students. Experts in classroom assessment will say that formative assessment measures should count 0 points. I teach our assessment class for our undergrads. The book we use, they say formative assessments, quizzes, other things along the way should not have any effect on the final grade. They take a strong stand and they say, how can you grade a student when the student admittedly doesn't know the information yet? Now, in practical application, that's not how it works. Many people count values to quizzes and other things along the way. One of the things we encourage and experts would encourage is in the big picture, it should be lower stakes than whatever they're doing later on, right? It should not have the same weight as something that comes later. Okay. Now, some of us, some of you in the room had the opportunity to do a book group with a book called Make It Stick, which I would recommend as a great read for everyone. By the way, I have some extra copies if you want them in my office in Tower. But the authors of Make It Stick, and again, they're talking about how to make student learning stick most effectively. They talk about something called retrieval practice, the ability to have students roll up their sleeves and engage in their learning. They love the idea of quizzes, regular quizzes, for example, through the semester, because students have to retrieve knowledge that they are just learning. When we have students practice through what? Formative kinds of measures. It could be homework, it could be quizzes, it could be little projects along the way. We should vary what we ask students to do. It shouldn't always take the same format. Shouldn't always be multiple choice quizzes. Research shows that if we can vary those practice experiences, it helps the learning stick for students. And then we should space it out over time. Students should have a chance to forget a little bit. It's good to forget and come back 3 days later and bring up some new ideas based on that same concept you're learning. Okay, so these are what the authors of Make It Stick assert. Now, what we know is that the power of feedback is the central force with summative assessment. And that's how I started this presentation, talking about the lack of feedback I got with the 17. We know that feedback is very, very powerful for students in the learning process. To be most effective, research tells us that the feedback needs to be specific. It should be non-evaluative. And what do I mean by that? And of course, there's some evaluation. It's almost like non-judgmental. Many of you teach with rubrics. That's a really helpful way, right? It shows students objectively. They don't say, Witikko, that effort really sucks. They say, here you are on the rubric right now. This is where you are objectively. This paper is at this point. Here's where you need to move to get to the higher level on the rubric. Feedback needs to be timely to be effective. That's a challenge for us, right? If we have 75 people in a classroom, 50 people in a classroom, it needs to be directly related to the learning goals, and it needs to provide direction for future learning, okay? So these, again, are research-based points about the power of feedback and how to make it most effective. Okay, paper number 2, Bemidji State, 1979. 1 month has passed. Now I got a wow, exhaustive. You covered the questions and very effectively too. Now this was an 8-page paper, and I wasn't really sure. The first paper was 4 pages. Now my friend Beth Levine would tell me in the School of Education, Witikko, do all of your responses to everything have to be so exhaustive? And she doesn't maybe use that in a positive kind of, I took this as a positive. I got something right here. This is an 8-page paper. My first one was 4 pages, and I moved from 17 points to 19 points. So in my mind, I'm going, more is good, right? That's how I took this feedback, right? And maybe this proved to my final paper of the semester in November, I got an 18 with a 6-pager. So really, I'm going, okay, 4 pages, 17, 19 points, I had an 8-pager, and this one was 6. So unfortunately, my feedback led me to believe there wasn't much about the content, right? I didn't really have feedback about the content that made me a better American Lit student. And so yeah, you know, so I asked that question. Now again, by the way, this was, by the way, I had a great experience at Bemidji State. I love that place. And this was a time when no one had ever even heard of things called rubrics. No one was using rubrics, right? And this was very typical for what I had received. Now, when Jane invited you here today, she asked some questions for you, and she set you up to understand. We're going to look at formative assessment today, and we're going to especially look at how can we give feedback. Now, one of the challenges, I've been a 36-year teacher, and 30 of those years, I taught high school English. I have evaluated scores of essays. And I think of all of the time I spent giving students feedback earlier in my career, many, many marginal notes, right? Sometimes writing narratives at the end of the paper that were longer than my students' original papers. And realizing as I did more studies and, you know, more research in this in my grad school, that more is not better in some of those cases. And in fact, some of us ask that question of, what do we do when we spend laborious time giving feedback to students and they don't even read it? I get revisions back and there's no changes, right? So there's some struggles with this. So Jane framed some questions for us in your invitation today. Is giving feedback to students taking more and more of your time? Are you giving the same feedback over and over? Do students recognize and respond to your feedback? Are you trying to integrate more assessment into the student learning process? And so what are we doing today? We're going to look at tips, apps, practices that our AT people are bringing to you that can save you time and provide useful feedback to students in their assignments. And by the way, for me, you know, one of the things that I went to that students really liked since I've been at CSS is video feedback to my students. Video feedback that hits big ideas where I can go through and talk about their paper as they're actually seeing their paper on the screen while I'm also recording my voice or recording my video image. And I've had really good luck anecdotally with students on that in terms of the kind of feedback they like. But what we want to do, so we're going to explore some possibilities, share your experiences, present your issues with feedback, with assessment, and then you get to test drive some of the tips and apps in today's session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and say, can we have you share some of your experiences? What have you seen as successes with formative assessment, especially with feedback? What are some of your frustrations? with providing feedback for students, and where do you need help? Pam.
I'm where I need help. In Blackboard, sometimes, well, not even Blackboard, I guess, traditional as well, but more so in Blackboard, I never know if they read my feedback. I have no idea. Sometimes I'll write all this stuff and then I think, I wonder if they even looked at that, or there'll be a revision and they didn't address it. So ideas for that would be helpful.
Awesome. Okay, how do we know that students are actually seeing my comments? Beth.
And to tag along with that, in Blackboard, there are lots of places where you can give feedback. So you can give feedback on every part of a rubric. You can give feedback by replying to assignments. You can give feedback over on a little sidebar. So I don't know if students, you know, I've tried putting feedback in different places because they're making the same mistakes again and again, and I worry that they haven't seen the feedback. So I don't even know how they find my feedback. I don't know where to tell them to look because theirs looks different than mine. And even when I go in as a student, I'm not sure where the best place in Blackboard to put the feedback would be.
Good. Great question. I think that'll be answered. So, folks, I should have mentioned one thing. Our people online are hearing you only through the microphone here, and so you're doing a great job. But as you're speaking, use those playground voices. How's that? Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I'm just going to follow up with what they just said. I realize now I have to announce at the beginning of the semester where to go in Blackboard. None of my students, I was giving laborious feedback, and none of my students got it, just because they didn't realize where to go. So I had to do that. That was in my evaluations. I got deducted because I never gave feedback. It was like, I just do all semester.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah.
As a new instructor, I'm slowly learning what, and I still don't know that I'm necessarily on target with giving them the right feedback when I am grading assignments.
And that's a great point too. And I think if we can remember, what's our best bet here, Jane? Probably just getting some of these on in the kind of the parking lot questions and address them later. Do we want to address any of these now?
Those are great questions. And as you're thinking about these, if you're hearing the question and maybe you're not answering it, somebody contribute to our resources, our live notes, maybe just jotting these down. Help us all take collective notes there. But we will be addressing some of this. How do I know what my students are seeing?
Sure.
By when we're getting into grading tips, Amy's going to show you how we're all going to walk through how we can see the grades and the feedback as a student. So we're going to see
Perfect.
that. And then also some of the talking about how to prepare students for that at the beginning of the class by doing a little introductory video. And Nikki's going to be sharing some things too. She's got her hand up.
I do. I was going to share some of the feedback that's come through on Zoom.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So we've got Pam Yorkman that says that she knows that they've seen the feedback when they actually start to apply some of the changes and revisions. And then Kelly Erickson shared that she likes giving concise feedback, but that worries that students will continue to make the other mistakes that she doesn't address if she just relies on concise feedback. So it's finding that balance.
Balance. Good. Other questions or struggles or successes with feedback? Oh, Beth.
The video does work, and I think Nikki and maybe Chris addressed that too, that the video does seem to work better than just written comments.
Yeah.
Even if I'm videoing a screenshot of the written comments I did and talking about it, that works better.
Good. Yeah, Nancy.
Yeah, so I certainly don't have the answers, but I can say that how I provide feedback continually seems to morph. And so what I've learned is that is in the message area in Blackboard, I tend to tell the students where the feedback is, so they know specifically. So if I'm using a Word document where I'm using track changes, I just say, see the attached document and Word changes and with the edits and the comments. And then the other piece is I've shifted a little bit from, because I do provide too much, I think a lot of feedback and sometimes too much feedback.
Right.
And I've shifted to providing less feedback directly to the students at times and then looking at the themes across the entire student population.
Right.
And saying, okay, what are the 5 or 6 common issues that I'm seeing in every paper? And then I tend to put those out in an announcement form.
Good. You know, I want to share one thing. Thank you for that, Nancy. One thing I want to share is, as we did the book study on Make It Stick, I did send some questions that came out of our book study to the authors. I sent some questions to the authors of the book. And finally, 3 weeks later, after our book club is done, I got a response this week. One of the things that was interesting, one of the authors pointed out, and I know this became an issue, this was a question with some of our nursing faculty who were in the book group. And I don't have an answer for you, but there were some interesting things. Because I asked them the question, we have some nursing faculty people who have quizzes and tests that are protected, that the questions are in a bank, that and it's difficult that they can't, that the best that they can do at the end is say that you got 25 right out of 30 without targeting, where our students might walk away not knowing which questions were wrong. The authors of the book said that can be really problematic and lead students to faulty understandings, because they will many times think they got a question right that wasn't right. And so so in other words, that lack of feedback to the specific problem of the quiz could very well work against student long-term learning, could be detrimental. Now, I don't know what the solution is for nursing people if these test banks are protected and you can't just say, well, you got number 23 wrong, which was this problem, right? But that's something to think about, because what people were doing made good sense. They were going in and they were making overall observations. In the big picture, some people struggled with this and some struggled with that. But the authors did note that there's a research base that would try to push us to more specificity if we could. So food for thought on that. Any other questions? Oh, you know, one thing I was going to say regarding Michelle's question too, the question about how do I know that the feedback that I'm giving is hitting the mark? You know, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the School of Education is really a clear focus defined by rubrics that will show the student on the rubric what the important elements were. One of the things that I learned as a lifelong writing teacher was that I couldn't expect students to do everything all of the time. If I expected students to have excellent ideas, excellent detailed support, and all of this in every paper, and I was providing this feedback that was just very broad over organization, ideas, mechanics, everything, even with senior students, I many times did not see the results I would see if I just focused in and said, in this formative assignment, I'm really having you focus on your ideas and support of those ideas. I am not worried about APA. I'm not worried about, you know what I'm saying? That focus, then when I did those papers, I'm really looking at just your central ideas and how you supported those. And that helped me both as a teacher, that helped my students also really understand what was important. Yeah, Heidi.
And to piggyback off on that a little bit, I think another challenge is when we have these compressed classes. So when you have an 8-week class over a 16-week class,
Right.
When you go back to that idea of iterative learning and having the students be able to rest between types of assessment, in this case maybe
Right.
papers that we're focusing on, there isn't that rest time.
Right.
And so I think that's also a real challenge. Also, timely feedback is really helpful. Like, they really care about that paper a couple days, you know, up until a couple days after they've done it. Well, again, if you're in this fast-paced course, how do you turn papers
That's right.
over that quickly
That's right.
so that they can use the formative assessment you've given them and implement it into their next paper, when they might very well be writing that next paper before you got that feedback back to them on the previous
Right.
paper. So that would be something that I would really encourage, is trying to have, you know, not so many big assignments, but little ones that are really targeted on certain aspects. And then maybe one summative one that's at the end.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
especially in these 8-week courses, you simply cannot have that many and be able to have the whole process be included in that.
Thank you for that. Good. So I think we're about at the half-hour mark, which is kind of what I had, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Jane or whoever's next, and I think we've framed some great questions for our morning work. So we can go with that. If you need to get set up differently, do you want me out of here? I can stop sharing.
Can you stop sharing it? Okay, I just want to check in with our online participants. How are we doing? We're trying to speak with our playground voices, but sometimes we forget. So just keep reminding us of that. Those notes, I see some things rolling in on the notes. So if you're missing something, please be checking those. I think that'll help. Any comments from the chat? Sarah, anything that people are asking about?
They can hear us.
Yay.
Good.
That's a win.
Okay. All right. Okay. So great conversations. Okay. All right. So feel free to get up and get some refreshments here. Sorry for you online. Maybe you've got different kinds of refreshments at your location, and use the restroom. We're going to roll into our hands-on and specific sessions of how to address some of these. Remember those questions that we asked. Make sure that we get them covered before you leave today. Okay. One thing that, as we're talking about feedback a lot here, is that D. Fink talks about feedback as not auditive, looking backwards, but educative, looking forward. And also someone, will have to find the citation. I was trying to paste in the notes, but I got something else pasted instead, and in case you saw a little blip there. Some people are talking about it as feed forward. So it's not really looking back, but it's looking forward, right, as we're considering it here. So I'll be putting those resources in the notes, but that might help frame what we're doing here, our work here. So